We're starting out on episode 1 of 3 in our new debate on should parents let their underage children drink alcohol? Welcome, I'm Danusha Malina-Derben. And if you're wondering how Parents Who Think debates work and you're a first timer here, circle back to the earlier episode called How PWT Debates Work. You'll get everything you need in that 10-minute episode. Now, before we get into it, let's do some PWT housekeeping. Oh, by the way, PWT is shorthand for Parents Who Think. If you're familiar with PWT, skip ahead. For newcomers, here's what to expect. This show features a unique debate format with set segments to make sure everyone gets a say. Each debate topic has 3 guests who share their distinct views. The debates span 3 episodes. Today, we start with an introduction to the topic and a brief introduction of the guests. 3 parents who share their stories in 200 words. Next is the Dishing the Dirt segment, where I share my experiences, before we move to the Say It in 6 segment, where guests summarise their opinions on the topic in, yes, you've guessed it, 6 words. Following this is the P That Fits Me segment, where guests choose a P word, predictable, progressive, or polarising, that best describes their view. They explain their choice, acknowledging that our opinions are often influenced by how others might perceive them. Now, each guest's P word is a clear declaration of their stance. Oh, and a warning triangle. In Parents Who Think debates, you'll hear opinions similar to your own, perhaps. And I bet my 10 kids, you'll hear from people whose opinions you find frustrating, confounding, and even obnoxious, including me, as I promise to show up as the flawed, disagreeable person I can be, whether you chime with or disagree with my opinions. Parents Who Think is a place for scrappy-edged, imperfect humans and our contrasting and contradictory views on hot topics, together in a diverse community. You won't agree with everything you hear, and that's exactly the point. Now, if you're uncertain about what you think, you found home. Expect debates where I'll share my uncertainty and even indifference. We don't have to be sure of what we think. If you want to read more about what I'm up to beyond this podcast, pop over to my day job bio on danushamalina-derben.com or find me on LinkedIn to connect if that's your thing. Now, for my night job, it's all over on the Parents Who Think Substack. Put the words Parents Who Think Substack in your search engine and it'll come up. Come on over. You'll find it a welcoming place. Now let's start today's debate with a quick intro to the topic. Allowing underage children to drink alcohol is a topic of significant debate among parents, educators, and health professionals. The discussion revolves around the potential benefits of introducing alcohol in a controlled environment versus the risks and long-term consequences of early alcohol exposure. The decision to allow underage children to drink alcohol is complex, with strong arguments on both sides, which we'll hear in this debate. While controlled exposure to alcohol might educate and reduce risky behaviours, the potential health risks, legal implications, and chances of addiction make it a contentious issue. Parents weigh these factors carefully, considering legal context, cultural background, and individual circumstances of their children. In England, Scotland, and Wales, for instance, it's not illegal for someone between the ages of 5 and 17 to drink alcohol at home or on other private premises. But this doesn't mean to say it's recommended. A recent study by the World Health Organization shows that the UK has the worst rate of child alcohol consumption worldwide, and more than half of children in England, Scotland and Wales have drunk alcohol by the age of 13. The analysis found that Great Britain had a significant issue with underage alcohol abuse. More than a third of boys, that's 35%, and girls, 34%, had drunk alcohol by the age of 11. And by 13, 57% of girls and 50% of boys in England had consumed alcohol, the highest rate included in the study. Now, many argue that promoting open communication and education about alcohol can help guide children to make informed and responsible decisions about drinking as they grow older. Now, there are also those who go further than talking about alcohol. These parents allow their children to drink alcohol in a controlled environment in order to teach about responsible drinking habits, the effects of alcohol, and the importance of moderation. Here in the UK, chief medical officers advise that an alcohol-free childhood is the healthiest and best option. But laws and opinions differ across the world. Now, it's time to introduce you to my 3 guests. Meet Kiaya from the Virgin Islands, Dave from the UK, and Casey from the States.
I have this saying that a bio could never do me justice. I'm a 43-year-old woman with 4 children. I have lived in the Virgin Islands for 20 years. I am from the Boot, aka the state of Louisiana, from a very small town off of I-20 called Cullen. I have lived here in the Virgin Islands for 20 years this year. I have been married for 20 years this year, and I enjoy life. I am loving being over 40, and the longer I live, the better it gets. I am a forward-thinking parent, and I go against the grain because I want to raise thinkers and not robotic children.
My name is Dave, and I'm a 50-something-year-old man who lives in the beautiful county of Northamptonshire. But I bet you can tell from my accent I wasn't born here. I grew up in a relatively secure childhood, but at the age of 14, my mum left the family home, which rocked my world quite a bit, and I went off the rails with heavy drinking and smoking. I got my first job in a carpet shop in Wimbledon, which was right next to a wine bar that a few stars from the local theatre used to drink in. And one of my claim to fame was arm wrestling the great Oliver Reed, and of course losing. In later years, I went on to be a handyman on 60-Minute Makeover and DIY SOS. After 40 years of excessive drinking, I finally gave up in 2019, which eventually led to a complete career change where I help people to address their own relationship with alcohol. And I've now recently qualified as a trauma-informed coach.
I'm Casey McMurray, a married, middle-aged American workaholic entrepreneur and dog mom who can't remember ever wanting to have children. Don't get me wrong, it's not that I'm not quote-unquote maternal. I'm nurturing to a fault. Loving on my family and pets, my colleagues and clients, my friends, and even strangers more than I love myself. And I've been a foster mom to kiddos recovering from the wounds inflicted by abusive and neglectful parents. I own a crib and a high chair. I'm what you might call parent material, but I don't have kids. I grew up in the U.S. Midwest in the 1980s and have the kind of stories that most Gen X latchkey kids can tell. My upbringing was vanilla, mediocre. Could have been better and could have been worse. I survived a little and learned a lot. And I have a lot of opinions for anyone who will listen.
Casey McMurray is a pseudonym. Casey is well known in several spheres, including being a renowned author. I asked her if she wanted to share that she's not using her real name.
I actually think you should tell your listeners that it's pseudonymous, because I think in the case of this story, it further reinforces sort of my position on it, that parents who create taboos around topics and behaviors in their family will sometimes perpetuate that taboo or the shaming that goes with that 50 years later. And that still, as a 50-year-old woman, I am still afraid of how my mother would react if she were to hear this interview. and feel called out on it, right? And while I feel confident she made a parenting mistake, that my parents made a parenting mistake in the way they treated the topic of alcohol, I still feel confident to talk about it to you and your audience confidently, but am terrified of what the fallout would look like if my mother were to hear this interview. And so I think it actually just reinforces my position on the topic.
Next, in the Dishing the Dirt section, I reveal what my childhood exposure to alcohol was like. I share my opinion on whether parents should let their underage children drink alcohol in the Last Words segment in episode 3 of this debate. For now, I'll tell you about me and the topic of alcohol. On the surface, my parents were the kind who drank only at high holidays like Christmas and birthdays. We didn't have alcohol in the home, and the height of my early interest in the taste of booze was at Catholic church when the priest served altar wine. I used to try for a swig, but felt eagle eyes on me, so went for a sip instead. Truth was, alcohol played a big part in my childhood. My father hid vodka bottles. His metal filing cabinet rattled. It was meant to hold nothing but papers, which reminds me of the brown paper bags he kept in the side pocket of the car. These bags with empty bottles were everywhere, in the basement, stuffed in shrubs, nestled behind books. My mother challenged him regularly about his drinking. He denied he drank at all, ever. I didn't need to be offered alcohol or encouraged to have alcohol underage for it to be a significant theme in my childhood. Whenever my dad came to pick me up from Bali in the evenings, I'd assess his behaviour. Would he be surly, silent, or seriously chatty? Each state was linked to drink intake. When life got tough for our family business, he needed to visit the car to get items he left there many times. He'd come back empty-handed. My mother drank 1 Guinness a month to keep her iron levels up, and slurped a tiny glass of eggnog at Christmas, much to my disgust. She was oh so measured, and I never saw her tipsy, let alone drunk. Perhaps she might have dropped her need for control if my father hadn't been necking back vodka. Now, one winter night, my father missed a hairpin bend entering our village and ploughed into the dense bank. The car was a write-off. He was smashed up. I collected his dentures from the local garage that dealt with the accident. I can't remember ever trying my father's vodka, even though I knew his hiding spots. Alcohol wasn't a big interest of mine as a child, or as I grew into being a teenager. In fact, I didn't drink alcohol till I was in my late 20s. But let's fast forward to parenting my 10 children and how this links to them drinking alcohol underage. I suspect that a while back I'll have offered a teenager a drink, but I can't remember when or what happened. I mean, I fancy at the time it was meant well, but back then I wasn't thinking consequences like I might now. I was thinking more about exposure to more adult things. Since I was a fan, I was a big fan of Prosecco and champagne. Our fridge had alcohol in it most days, and my witching hour was 6 o'clock in the evening. 5 years ago, on a whim of an experiment, I stopped drinking alcohol. I wanted to see what life would be like without booze in it. The experiment, that was going to last a week if I was lucky, spread to a month, then on to a year. I found I love being sober, and here I am at year 5. This means my triplets have no memory of seeing me drink alcohol or having this in our home. To be honest, I'm not sure how I'm going to navigate this with them. We talk about the effects of drinking and why people drink, but they're not exposed to alcohol. Is this the right way forward for them and for our family? Well, In episode 3 of this debate, I'll share candidly on whether parents should let their underage children drink alcohol. I'm having to think hard about it. Now let's scotch the idea, excuse the pun, that life as parents is a neatly packaged up experience, shall we? Let's move to the Say It in 6 segment with Kiaya, Dave, and Casey.
So let's start with your Say It in 6.
I support parental supervised underage drinking.
It's noticeable that you're saying supervised underage drinking.
Yes. And when you have children and you want to keep them safe, it's kind of hard. And so I began to say, I wish I could raise my children on an island. Well, Denisha, I live on an island. And it's like, okay, this isn't good enough anymore. So it kind of became, okay, I have to prepare my children for the world. I live on an island. I don't consider it the real world. I have to prepare my children for the world.
Kiaya is a clear yes to children drinking alcohol underage. The key to this for her is parental supervision to prepare her children for the real world.
Tell me what your Say It in 6, Dave, is.
My Say It in 6 is protect your children at all costs.
Tell me a bit more about that. What do you mean?
Well, I think we've got a responsibility, to be good role models in life, to protect them, because after all, we protect them in many other areas in life. And it seems to me when it comes to alcohol, that it's such a socially accepted drug that there seems to be a different spin on it. If they were going to McDonald's every single day, we'd have something to say to it. If they was watching too much Netflix, we would be having, putting blocks on their account and stuff, too much social media. But when it comes to alcohol, I just think there's such a loose narrative around it. And I think we need to protect them, educate them, be role models to help them understand, what the perils of alcohol can be potentially.
So when you liken it to Netflix and going to Mackie D's, golden arches as we like to call it, I mean, are you likening alcohol to that?
Well, I suppose I'm likening it to everything in excess.
Protect your children at all costs is a no to kids drinking underage. Let's see what my third guest Say It in 6 is. Who's Casey?
Frustrated, passionate, wounded, shamed, enlightened, and convinced. I think the nub of the argument is this. If we don't demonize drinking, and if we don't mystify alcohol to our children, we won't set our children up to become sneaky sleuths who get themselves into trouble and pain. If we trust our children to be thoughtful and mature, they can be. If we as adults are prudish and afraid, we raise fearful and I think eventually rebellious children. So making things taboo, like alcohol, for children ultimately only harms them in the long run.
So you're a yes, let children drink alcohol. Yeah.
Right. Let them have a sip. I mean, I don't know that I would go so far as to buy them a case of beer for them, for their friends or whatnot. But I definitely don't think there's any harm in letting your kid have a glass of champagne on New Year's Eve or if they want to. So yeah, why the heck not? It's a fermented beverage. Let's just do it wisely.
What had you choose those 6 words?
Yeah, it was really such a great question. And my response to it was really visceral. So frustrated with parents, including my own, for not getting it, not understanding that saying, no, we're not going to talk about something, or it is not okay, or it's taboo, creates so many questions in the mind of a child. And then that child feels that they can't ask those questions. And so I spent my entire lifetime not getting answers to those questions.
Casey's 6 words give us a flavour of her feelings towards this topic. Another yes vote, but for very different reasons. Whenever a guest offers a list of words, not a sentence, I find there's a story behind it that needs digging into. If you've not listened to the debate on should schools teach about gender identity and sexual orientation, you might want to seek that one out. Amy, one of my guests, offered a list of words that gave an arc to her opinion on that tough topic.
And so that frustration persists over time. I'm passionate about parents and all adults who have influence over children, whether it's aunts and uncles and grandparents and foster parents and teachers. I'm passionate about treating children just like little humans that we can have real conversations with, and that there's no shame or taboo in any question or any topic, that everything is on the table. And I feel very passionate about that. I think wounded and ashamed really align with one another, and that, 50 years later, I still have wounds around how my family's approach to alcohol ended up impacting my life in a negative way. And that has changed me. And there is still shame that was unearned, right? My older brother and I were taught to feel a sense of shame around things like alcohol or sex. And those were unearned shame.
Casey is a foster parent. More on that later. And she recounted the moment that brought her enlightenment on kids and drinking.
I feel mature or enlightened around this, and that I feel like a light bulb went off for me at one point when there was an opportunity, when we had some friends over and we were pouring cocktails, and one of them had a teenage child, and you could tell she was curious because the drink we were making was pretty. And I looked at her mother and I said, would you like me to make her one? Is it okay for me to make her one? And would you like me to leave the alcohol out? And then I incorporated that teenager into that conversation. I didn't take her mother aside and whisper it. I had the conversation there with the teenager, and she was kind of smiling sheepishly, like, oh, I hope my mom says yes. And her mom said, sure, and looked at her daughter and said, do you want to try it? And she said, yeah. And so I made her one, and she drank it and she enjoyed it. And there was no taboo around there. There was no shame. And it was all about consent and choice. The parent had a say, the child had a say. And I felt like a light bulb went off for me in that moment, that this is no big deal, even though my parents spent my entire childhood telling me this is a big deal.
There's one more word. It's convinced.
I'm convinced, based on many, many experiences like that one, the more that we demonize the concept of drinking or alcohol, the more that we mystify it to our children, the more that we set them up for failure, the more that we set them up to feel bad about themselves, and maybe to make some choices that could ultimately be harmful to them. So I'm feeling pretty convinced.
Dave is convinced too.
I'm actually sober myself after 40 years of drinking, so I haven't been a saint in my life at all. So I'm not sitting here on my high chair preaching to everyone the rights and wrongs of my life, because I've been terrible. But I suppose what comes from that is that I've learned and educated myself around the harms of alcohol, and I see where it can go in excess. And of course, there are guidelines. The government got guidelines of 14 units a week that many people try and stick to. But for children, it's easy to break that. And I think it's really imperative that we educate children to understand alcohol more and the harms of it. Because when I was growing up, there wasn't such a thing. It was everyone did it and no one really knew. And, you look at smoking, that people know a lot more about it. And I don't know about you, Danusha, but I don't think I know anyone that actually smokes anymore. And they're talking about banning vapes, banning smoking for children under 15. Yet when it comes to alcohol, that's not even spoken about. Mm-hmm. So I think it's about the right education and how to protect our children at all costs.
Protecting children is high on Kiaya's mind. It drives her to prepare her 4 children, age appropriately, for the world they'll be adults in.
I wanted to make sure that my children were aware as well, because they're going to go into the world, and I don't want something to happen to them or they're in a predicament because they didn't know. When you realize that you can't be with your children all the time, you're kind of forced to make sure that they're prepared. And so I'm kind of spastic about making sure that my children know as much as possible to be productive, great, themselves adults.
A point here about the difference in qualitative assessment of the term spastic between British and American audiences is needed. There are cultural differences in usage of this word. In the UK, it's seen as a highly offensive, ableist slur by some people. In other countries, not so much. Casey is a yes to children drinking underage in a bid to stop demonising alcohol or drinking and to demystify it. She's not a yes to kids getting drunk or adults enabling this. Kiaya is also a yes to parents letting their children drink underage. She believes in prepping kids for the real world so that they're equipped. This is one form of making sure her children are protected and can be discerning with alcohol. Dave is a loud no. He wants kids protected from the harms of alcohol. Now, we've heard these parents declare where they stand on this topic. Let's get into the P that fits me segment. I'm curious which P these parents will choose. Will any of them decide their opinion is polarising or progressive? Maybe they'll all see themselves as having predictable opinions. Let's find out.
What is the P that fits me? Are you predictable, progressive, or polarising?
I think on this topic, I'm progressive. Listen, I live in the United States, and we have our legal drinking age here of 21, though in some states for a long time it was 18. And I live right on the border of two states where in one state it had been 21 and the other state it had been 18. And I remember 18, 19, 20-year-olds all driving across the border just to be able to drink away from home. And I remember what that was like. And so I know that there are plenty of folks, maybe sort of on the predictable side, who would say the law is the law. The way we've always done it is the way we've always done it. Alcohol is for adults, not for children. And we're not going to talk about it. Right. And I think on the other side of that, that's sort of the more polarizing side of it might be the parents who are throwing parties for their kids and buying cases of beer and letting the kids sort of drink beyond a taste and sort of beyond a buzz to actual intoxication. That's not something that I think is necessarily a great idea. And I don't see sort of a purpose in it. And I think that could be harmful for children as well. So I don't see myself as being on the polarizing end of the perspective. But I definitely think that every conversation should be on the table with children.
This debate isn't about conversation, though it's a critical part of educating kids about alcohol. Conversation isn't pouring a drink for kids. Here's Dave.
I've looked at this and it's a fascinating context here. So I will put myself in the progressive category.
Now, you all say it in sixes, protect your children at all costs. Why isn't that a predictable opinion? Surely we all want to protect our children at all costs.
That's a great question. And I think drinking is so embedded in our society. For instance, if you were to give up caffeine, which I know a lot of people always say to me, oh God, that's the next thing on the list. And I actually have. I've been caffeine free for a year because I realised, and I don't want to, again, come across like a saint, but it wasn't serving me. So I could have 2 or 3 coffees in the morning and be great. And then by midday, I'm having a power nap, you know. But no one ever mentions that, do they? They would be cheerleading me. Oh, I've stopped smoking. I've stopped vaping. I don't eat meat anymore. Oh, amazing, brilliant, fantastic. I've stopped drinking. What? Are you serious? And I've known one of my clients, she came to me, she said her friend actually said to her, oh, right, okay, well, come back to me when you're normal then. You know, that kind of reaction. And it's so accepted in society. You know, it is the only drug we justify not having, which is ridiculous these days. And we see it everywhere.
Dave thinks alcohol is embedded into the fabric of society and that people aren't exactly encouraging or cheerleading those who opt out of alcohol. I asked Kiaya which P fits her opinion. We've got 2 progressives. Will she make it a hat trick?
I think it's a tad bit progressive because, again, we are becoming, well, let me not even say we're becoming. If you look historically, especially in the Western, I've never lived in the Eastern side of the world. So I can't speak to that. I've been to a few places and they drink. Like for instance, in Italy, wine is a big deal. Like weed is a big deal in Amsterdam. Been there too. So there are just these normalcies. And I think that people have made so many things taboo. Everything is taboo these days. Like you can't do this, you can't do that. I mean, it's just so restrictive. And we're coming out of that. I feel like I'm more like the generations of today to where I'm more open-minded. I'm more just open to different ways of doing things. Whereas the past generations, like my mother's generation, my aunts, my uncles, it was kind of rigid. We're coming out of that to the point to where this is really going to be something that's kind of normalized.
Parentally supervised underage children drinking alcohol is what I assume Kiaya is getting at here. That it's going to become normal for underage kids to drink. And yes, we have 3 progressive parents' opinions in this debate. I mean, what are the odds? Let's get back to Kiaya.
It's not, of course, not going to be normalized in every household because, it takes a little bit of educating yourself, understanding yourself, healing of yourself for you to decide that I'm going to do something differently. Not everybody can take that step and decide that they're going to do something differently. But when I, again, went through experiences to where it's like, okay, now I have 4 little people, or 2 biggies and 2 littles, as I refer to them, I need for them to be prepared. I need for them not to be out there trying to experiment. And I do believe that we're moving the metric system a little bit. We're moving the measuring stick a little bit to say that this is it's becoming normalized.
According to States-based 2022 National Survey on Drug Use and Health, that's the NSDUH, 13.2 million people aged 12 to 20, 34.2% in this age group, reported that they've had at least 1 drink in their lives. But NSDUH findings show a decline in underage drinking. From 2002 to 2022, the prevalence of alcohol use in the past 30 days decreased by 47.4% among people aged 12 to 20. Now, underage alcohol consumption is not declining in the UK, judging by the 2022 World Health Organization study.
I was in a traffic jam the other day and there was banners all the way along the main road that hadn't really anything to do with the supermarket, but it was like, buy 6 bottles of wine, get 25% off. 24 cans of Stella, $15.99. You go in the supermarket and it's like in the old days where they would have sweets at the counter at the till and the kids are like biting their ankles off to have the sweets. It's in films, cinemas, everywhere you look. And I just think it's so accepted.
Last words on the P that fits me go to Casey.
And I think that there's just zero harm done in a child having a sip of something or having a glass of wine or a champagne on a special occasion like New Year's Eve so they can participate in a ritual with their families. I just don't see any harm in that, even though I'm surrounded by a lot of people who do. And so that's, I think, why I would call myself a little progressive.
We've got 3 guests with self-defined progressive views for very different reasons, whether it's to educate kids about what Dave knows are the perils of alcohol, or to prepare kids for the real world like Kiaya is doing, or because demystifying alcohol might mean, as Casey hopes, children are less inclined to experiment with it in unsupervised environments. How about you? Have a think about your opinion and whether you think it's a predictable, progressive, or polarising one. How about your close friends? Are you surrounded by diverse views on this topic? The PWT debates are deeply personal. Guests reflect on how they were raised and frequently share the struggles they've endured, their successes along the way, and how all this affects the ways they raise children. In case you don't know, guests include biological, adoptive, step, and foster parents. There are many variations, obviously, of parents. Now, this particular debate is a notch more personal as guests chose to let us into their intimate journeys with alcohol. Expect opinion through storytelling. Life experience shapes our decisions and our actions. My guests begin by telling us about their early childhood.
I was born in the 60s and my mum and dad didn't really drink apart from my dad making homemade wine. So I was fascinated by the demijohns under the stairs. And when he would get them out, I would watch the bubbles. Do you remember the little sort of tube on the top and the bubble would go round? And I remember my uncle and auntie used to come round and they would make slow gin as well and stuff like that. And they were giggly and stuff, but I probably went to bed before anything happened after that anyway, you know.
You know, I kind of grew up in a stout Christian home, and this was wrong and that was wrong. And then those that I worship with, it was like of the devil. And I know my mother specifically, not so much my dad, but my mother it was all, this is what the Bible says. You don't drink because the Bible says you don't drink, or whatever it was. But it was, you either don't do it because the Bible says don't do it, or you do it because the Bible says, and that was it.
So I grew up for most of my life with a mom and a dad in the house and an older brother who's a few years older than me. And my family were, I don't know that I knew that the word at the time, we were sort of teetotalers, right? Folks who didn't drink at all. I had never, growing up, had never seen my parents drink. We never had alcohol in the house. If someone, as a gift or an anniversary gift for my parents or whatnot, gave them a bottle of wine, it would sit in the refrigerator forever, and nobody would ever open it. And they would even, if it was a red, they probably put it in the fridge because they didn't know you don't put reds in the fridge because we knew nothing about alcohol. And eventually somebody would open it and pour it down the sink drain and throw away the bottle. And so I never saw my parents drink, ever. If we were at a party and somebody was serving drinks, my parents always said, no, thank you. And they would have water or soda or iced tea or something. And it was something that we just didn't really talk about when I was really young at all.
This sets the scene for what comes next. My yes guests, Casey and Kiaya, both learned about alcohol as a strictly prohibited substance, whether through the lens of religious beliefs or stony silence on the matter. My no guest, Dave, didn't describe his early years as affected by alcohol. Let's pick up the story with Dave.
Things changed when I was around 12. We moved from Croydon to Carshalton, and starting secondary school in the second year was terrifying for me because I'd left all my friends behind that I'd grown up with. And I remember going in this classroom and it was like something out of a film like The Bronx. It was really rough and there was all these 6-foot lads looking at me up and down. And I was a little bit wet behind the ears, to be honest. And they kept saying to me, all right, Dave, you're going to come up the shop so we can have a drink and a fag. And I was like, oh, my God, that's my worst nightmare, right? But then my mum left the family home out of the blue. I literally had no idea. And I came down, I was 14 years old, and I found a letter on the table, and it's from my mum. And she said, I'm leaving your dad, not sure when I'll be in touch, but I will be. And that was it. There was no explanation or anything.
Imagine, out of the blue, your life shatters, and you've no idea why.
And then shortly after that, my dad met someone else as well. And I remember sitting in my bedroom, hearing them giggling. And one night the central heating went down. And so I sat down because they had a gas fire, and she was rolling her eyes and tutting and huffing and that. And I looked at my dad, for him to kind of back me up, and he didn't. And it was the loneliest I felt in my entire life. And I was only 14. And I remember leaving the house and just bursting out crying. And it was shortly after that, one of the big lads said, you coming up the shop to want a fag? And I thought, you know what, I've got nothing to lose. So I went up there terrified, and I had my first can of Foster's outside the off licence. And then I had my second one, and then they started saying, actually, you're all right, you are, Dave, because you're quite a laugh. And what the alcohol did, it gave me confidence. It gave me a sense of belonging in the group. But
Yeah.
what I want to sort of say here is that I had no education around alcohol. It's just what we did as kids, hanging around the shops.
Dave's drinking changed.
I didn't start off with drinking a bottle of vodka night. I started off with a can at the shops outside the off license where the lads were nicking money from the sofa, finding money down the side of the sofa and asking the adults to buy us drinks outside the off license. And we'd have a couple of cans of Fosters and be away with the fairies, going home and looking at the ceiling spinning and throwing up. But it's such a progressive drug.
In episode 2, we'll hear more about Dave's drinking. I asked Kiaya to tell me about her parents' religion and alcohol.
My mother, in my opinion, was over-religious, and my daddy was under-religious.
Did they meet in the middle?
They did not. My dad, when he went to any type of service, it was your typical Easter and Christmas. And then he just decided that ain't for him. So he's not going to do it. My mother, on the other hand, forced us to go about 5 days a week. For my mother, alcohol was not a positive thing. She doesn't really talk a lot about her past. I kind of think that she was a heavy drinker. And when she became a Christian, she gave all of that up, to the point to where she kind of wanted my daddy to give it up. Now, I don't think my daddy was a heavy drinker, but I do remember that my daddy would keep his Crown Royal in the purple bag in the windowsill in the kitchen. And we would sample it. It was disgusting. It was horrible, but it was so forbidden that we were drawn to it. All of my siblings have had a swig of it a time or two. And that was his drink of choice. I don't recall my daddy ever being drunk. I don't even recall ever actually seeing him drink, except maybe a beer out in the yard with his friends after they were finished working on vehicles or something.
Sandwiched between a fiercely religious mother and a father with a bottle or two of whiskey, what was she supposed to do?
But the Crown, and I think I've seen Hennessy in the house, just those two. I don't recall seeing him drink them. I just know they were there, and we would sneak a swig. And I think that's what turned me off, because they were just so disgusting. I just thought they were nasty. But I wanted to know. I wanted to experience it. And I snuck and did it and didn't have anybody to talk to about it, because we didn't talk to each other about it, because no one's supposed to do it. So I don't want you to know that I did it, but I know you did it. I don't want that.
I had to know more about Casey and her teetotal parents.
So it was sort of mysterious, because I would see aunts or uncles or other people having a drink. I had never been to a bar, to a tavern, to a place that has somebody behind a counter mixing drinks until I was probably, I think, 8 or 9. We were sort of out in the country visiting one of my cousins and aunts and uncles. And it was more cultural where they lived, to like go hang out at the bar after work, and for children to come walking in and the bartender to know the children's names. And I remember walking into a bar with my older cousin, and I thought it was interesting. It was sort of dark in there, and everybody was very friendly. But I remember telling our mom about it later that afternoon, and she was mortified, just absolutely mortified. But we didn't drink. Nobody offered us anything. I think maybe we had some peanuts or a snack or something, and it was demonized. And I felt like I had done something really wrong by just walking through that door behind my cousin. And my childhood was very much about that. I, to this day, don't know why neither of my parents drink. So I'm assuming it's because there was a certain amount of alcoholism in their own families. I know that my mom had a mother who had periods of alcoholism in her own life, and had a grandfather who drank and I think was loud and maybe violent when he did. And I think my dad's dad had a problem with alcohol, but no one ever talked about it.
Casey's parents' response to alcohol was shrouded in silence.
But then I do remember very vaguely, but in a very visceral, painful way that was actually hard for me as I prepared for our conversation today, that I think my mother thought that I and my brother were somehow sort of at risk or exposed somehow, that we had a grandmother who maybe drank a little bit too much when she drank. And it really wasn't impacting us other than these, couple of random stories. We didn't live with our grandparents. They weren't making parenting decisions for us. We were not being harmed by someone's overindulgence. And yet I was forced to go to some meetings for Alcoholics Anonymous, had a Al-Anon teen or some sort of program that children could go to, right? For children who were suffering the very real, very serious effects of growing up with alcoholic parents or other caregivers. But that was not the case for me. And I was forced to go to these meetings. And I remember sitting in folding chairs and the basement of a church somewhere, I think, and people crying and then people expecting me to cry, even though I wasn't sad about it. And I remember those meetings were really scary. And I didn't understand why I had to go to a meeting about alcohol when alcohol really played essentially zero role in my family's lives.
Casey's mother experienced something growing up that related to her own mother's alcohol consumption. In her efforts to protect Casey from potential harm, she enrolled her in an Al-Anon program. But there was a missing piece.
And I look back on it and I still don't really understand that. And so for most of the time, alcohol was sort of a non-issue until it became an issue because it was something that we didn't understand.
I wasn't expecting what Casey shares about one particular day involving her mum and wine.
I don't really remember much talking about alcohol with my dad, but my mom was definitely very terrified of it and really sort of made it taboo for us. And I remember, I was probably 10 years old or something. And so my brother was a few years older than me. And I remember, we lived in a very small house, single-story house with a basement. And we kind of had a playroom in the basement where all our toys were. And my mom's friend came over to visit. And I think looking back at it, that my mom's friend may have been going through something, whether it was a divorce or something. And the friend brought a bottle of wine with her. And she and my mom sat down at the kitchen table. And the bottle of wine was sitting on the table. And I don't know whether it was open or not. And I remember going upstairs and walking through the kitchen, and I think I was going to my bedroom or to go use the toilet or something, and I saw the bottle of wine on the table. And I remember running back downstairs to the basement to tell my big brother that, oh my God, there's wine, there's alcohol on the kitchen table. And I remember being terrified. To me, because of the way we had been raised, it may as well have been a loaded gun. And I remember crying, and I remember shaking, and I remember kind of quietly whispering with him, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And I really, truly, and so did he, thought that somehow what my mom was doing, if she was going to drink a glass of that she was bad and that she might die. And I remember sneaking upstairs to my bedroom to get a piece of paper and a pen, and running back downstairs with my brother. And we wrote a note to my mom, begging her not to drink it, begging her, please, 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 we don't know why you want to drink this. And we put upon her the shame that she had been putting upon all of us around the topic of alcohol for our young lives. And I remember shaking and feeling nauseated and going up the stairs into the kitchen with my brother next to me and giving her the note and standing there crying while she read it. And so it's really interesting, right? And how does a mother then say, oh, no, it's no big deal, it's just a bottle of wine, when for every moment up to then, you have demonized the very concept of that bottle of wine. So when I was really, really young, I was absolutely terrified of alcohol. And then, of course, when I became a teenager, it became a different story.
What kind of different story? Casey tells us in the next episode. Before we go, Kiaya lets us in deep.
When I was growing up, we were very underexposed. We were very sheltered. And I kind of go against the grain. I know when I was growing up, there was a big difference between like white culture and black culture, where if you went to a house party with your white counterparts in high school, there was beer. It just was not that big of a deal. I mean, of course, if they got caught, they got in trouble. but it's just something that's just known to happen. Whereas in the Black culture, it's just shunned, like, oh my God, I can't believe they brought beer. Let's leave. It's just really, really different. That just didn't make sense to me. And because I grew up in a Black neighborhood, but with white people, it was a stark difference between the family dynamics for white people and the family dynamics for Black people. And I didn't like it in the Black community. I didn't like what we did to each other. And I liked it better with my white family because they were like my aunts and uncles, That's how it is in the South, Older people are always your aunts and uncles. And so these white women and men were my aunts and uncles. And we spent so much time with them that it became like where I was more comfortable. And so from a little girl, I began to be like, why is it different? Why is it different?
Next week, in episode 2 of the Should Parents Let Their Underage Children Drink Alcohol debate, my 3 guests will get up on their high horse about whether they think we should pour drinks for underage kids or not. Things get raw and messy. I hope you'll join me. Now, if you've got something to say about anything you've heard today or on another PWT debate, come on over to the Parents Who Think Substack community to leave a comment or leave your thoughts on our YouTube channel called Parents Who Think. If you like the show, would you tell a friend about it so that we can grow our reach even further? Thanks for being a supporter of the show. Take care, everyone.